The air was thick with the crisp autumn chill, and the streets of New York pulsed with life, each person lost in their own world, rushing somewhere, nowhere. The aroma of roasted chestnuts mingled with the distant scent of a hot dog cart. In the heart of the city, outside an upscale café on Fifth Avenue, a woman stood waiting for her car. She was wrapped in an oversized camel-colored coat, her blonde hair tucked under a knitted beanie, her face half hidden behind dark sunglasses. The world knew her name, Taylor Swift, but today, she wasn't here as the global superstar, the record-breaking artist, the billionaire. She was just another person grabbing a coffee on a cold afternoon, hoping to go unnoticed. The moment she stepped onto the sidewalk, adjusting the paper cup in her hands, a voice stopped her. "Miss, can you give me food?" Taylor turned. The voice belonged to a man, mid-50s, his beard unkempt, his eyes sunken but strikingly alert. He was hunched inside a ragged coat too thin for the weather, his hands gripping a plastic bag filled with who knew what. He didn't reek of alcohol, nor did he slur his words. His voice was steady, almost quiet, as if he had long stopped expecting a yes. A security guard nearby straightened, already stepping forward, prepared to push the man away. People sitting at the outdoor tables glanced over, some raising their eyebrows, others looking down at their phones, pretending they hadn't heard. This wasn't unusual. Beggars approached the rich all the time, and usually, the answer was a simple, dismissive shake of the head. Some would hand out $1, just to be done with it. Others wouldn't even slow their pace. Taylor, however, didn't move. She just stood there, staring at him. The man's gaze remained steady, but there was something else in it, something beyond hunger. A silent challenge, as if he wasn't really asking for food, but for something more. Something people rarely gave him. A moment of dignity. Then, before Taylor could respond, the cafe manager stormed out, his apron swaying as he rushed toward them. "Sir, you can't ask customers for money here," he snapped, glancing at Taylor apologetically, like she was some fragile princess who needed saving from an inconvenient scene. "Move along now, or I'll have to call someone to." Taylor lifted her hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. The manager froze. The security guard hesitated. The homeless man waited. And then, for the first time in the last few years, Taylor Swift did something that left everyone in shock. Taylor Swift's hand remained raised in the air for a long moment, her fingers slightly curled as if holding onto an invisible thread of control over the scene unfolding in front of her. The cafe manager, caught between authority and uncertainty, swallowed hard, his lips parting as if he wanted to protest but lacked the courage to do so. The security guard shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hand still resting on the belt of his dark uniform, waiting for a signal, an order, anything that would tell him how to proceed. The air between them was thick with an expectation, one that demanded Taylor's next move be predictable, safe, and in line with how celebrities handled situations like this. Instead, she did something no one had anticipated. She turned toward the homeless man fully, taking a slow step closer, her presence so steady that the people sitting nearby at the cafe tables lowered their voices, pretending not to watch but leaning in just enough to hear what would happen next. Taylor's sunglasses slid down the bridge of her nose just a little, revealing a sliver of her piercing blue eyes as she studied the man in front of her, taking in every detail: the sharp lines on his face, the uneven patches of stubble on his chin, the way his fingers twitched slightly from either cold or exhaustion. He wasn't just another anonymous figure on the street. He had a name, a story, a life that had unraveled in ways that most people passing by would never bother to understand. "You're hungry," she said, her voice calm, but not soft, not pitying. It was a statement, not a question, and something in the way she said it made the man hesitate for the first time since approaching her. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady, as if testing whether she meant what she was implying, or if this was just another performance meant to look good in a viral clip later. "I am." Taylor turned to the cafe manager, who was still standing stiffly, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the small notepad he had stuffed in the pocket of his apron. His entire demeanor was defensive, like he expected her to lash out at him for trying to remove the man in the first place. "Give him whatever he wants," she said, and her tone was absolute. sharp enough to cut through the momentary hesitation in the manager's expression. He blinked, clearly unsure if she was serious, or if this was some kind of social experiment. "Miss Swift, we have policies," he started, his voice dropping to a more private volume, as if he thought if he spoke quietly enough, the other customers wouldn't hear. "We can't just—" "Did I ask for policies?" Taylor interrupted, her voice not loud, not aggressive, but laced with a certainty that made it impossible to argue. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a black card, the kind of credit card that people in places like this never doubted, never questioned. Charge whatever he wants to this. A meal, a drink, dessert, whatever he feels like eating. The manager hesitated for only a fraction of a second before reaching out to take the card, but before his fingers could even graze the surface of it, Taylor pulled it back slightly, tilting her head just enough to make it clear that she wasn't finished. "And make sure," she continued, her gaze locking onto his, "that no one rushes him out the second he finishes eating. He sits inside, at a table, just like anyone else. No one bothers him. No one tells him he has to leave." The weight of her words settled heavily between them. The manager's face flickered with something that could have been guilt, or maybe just the realization that he wasn't in control of this situation anymore. He exhaled sharply, nodding once before finally reaching for the card again, this time taking it without another word and turning toward the cafe's entrance. Taylor looked back at the homeless man, who hadn't moved, his face unreadable but his hands curling into fists at his sides, not in anger, but in something more complicated, something close to disbelief. "You didn't have to do that," he said, but there was no resentment in his voice, only the quiet weight of someone who had long stopped expecting kindness without strings attached. "I know," Taylor answered simply, her expression unreadable, her posture unwavering. She wasn't performing. She wasn't making a scene for the sake of making herself look good. This wasn't charity, at least not the kind that people did for the sake of being seen. The cafe's door swung open again as the manager stepped inside, disappearing behind the glass, and for the first time since this moment had begun, the energy in the air shifted. The security guard, who had been lingering at the edge of the interaction, finally exhaled, looking away as if realizing he no longer needed to stand on high alert. The people sitting nearby had no choice but to acknowledge what had just happened. Some of them exchanging glances, some of them looking down at their untouched coffee cups. One woman, sitting at a corner table with a designer handbag perched beside her chair, frowned slightly, as if trying to understand why this moment felt different from the usual scenes of celebrities performing generosity for an audience. She had seen famous people hand out $100 bills before, had watched influencers film themselves giving food to the homeless, had heard stories about grand gestures that always seemed perfectly timed for maximum exposure. But this wasn't that. Taylor Swift wasn't filming this. She wasn't waiting for applause. She wasn't handing out money to walk away feeling better about herself. She was treating a man like a human being. And that, somehow, was what made it so unsettling for everyone else who had grown used to ignoring people like him. The homeless man finally moved, shifting his weight slightly before inhaling deeply, as if testing whether he was still in control of his own body after standing so still for so long. He glanced at the cafe door, then back at Taylor. "Thank you," he said, and this time, his voice held something new. Not just gratitude, but something heavier, something closer to the quiet disbelief of a man who had spent too many years being invisible. Taylor nodded once, slipping her hands back into the pockets of her coat, already taking a small step backward, ready to leave without expecting anything in return. But just as she turned away, the man spoke again, his voice quieter this time, but sharp enough to cut through the noise of the city around them. "You didn't even ask my name." Taylor stopped. A beat of silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then she turned back, and when she finally spoke, her words sent a ripple through the air, something that made even the strangers sitting nearby feel the weight of this moment in their bones. "You didn't ask mine either." And with that, she walked away. The cafe manager hesitated near the register, gripping Taylor Swift's black card in his fingers as if it were heavier than it should have been. The staff behind the counter stole quick glances at him, waiting for direction, but the weight of the moment had unsettled something in him. The man outside, the one he had been ready to dismiss, was still standing near the entrance, his posture stiff, uncertain, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Customers inside the cafe, those who had witnessed the exchange, exchanged hushed words, their voices laced with something between curiosity and discomfort. A few of them shifted in their seats, their hands wrapping around warm cups of coffee, some stealing discreet glances at the man outside, wondering if he would actually step inside or if he would refuse the offer out of pride. The door creaked open, and the sound of the city seeped into the cafe as the man finally stepped forward, the shift in temperature making the people nearest to him instinctively lean away. His presence was something they weren't used to, something that disrupted the carefully curated atmosphere of high-end pastries and overpriced lattes. He took slow, deliberate steps toward the counter, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was measuring every reaction around him. His fingers twitched slightly, as if he was preparing for someone to change their mind, for someone to tell him that this had all been a mistake, that the kindness offered to him was conditional after all. The manager inhaled deeply before looking at the cashier. Give him anything he wants. No restrictions. His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, an acknowledgement that the situation had shifted beyond what he had expected. The cashier, a young woman with a ponytail and a sharp, calculating gaze, hesitated only briefly before turning toward the man. Her voice was neutral, professional, but lacking the forced politeness she usually reserved for high-paying customers. What would you like to order? The man blinked, as if the words took longer to register than they should have. He glanced at the menu overhead, his fingers tightening around the strap of the plastic bag he carried, his lips parting slightly before pressing into a firm line. I don't know, he admitted after a moment, his voice quieter than before. I haven't looked at a menu in a while. Something about the way he said it made the cashier pause. There was no embarrassment in his voice, no plea for sympathy. It was just a fact, simple and unpolished, something that shouldn't have been extraordinary but somehow was. A silence settled between them, thick enough that the manager found himself clearing his throat, suddenly aware of how much attention this transaction had drawn. Take your time, the cashier finally said, her voice softer than before, as if something about the way he stood there had shifted something in her as well. The man let his eyes skim over the list of items, his gaze lingering on the simpler meals, the ones that weren't extravagant, the ones that felt safer to choose. After a moment, he exhaled slowly. A sandwich, any kind, and coffee, black. The manager glanced at the cashier and gave a short nod, signaling her to move forward with the order. She tapped at the register, her fingers moving faster now, as if trying to regain a sense of normalcy. The cafe's usual rhythm had been interrupted, but the world hadn't stopped spinning. People still sipped their drinks, the hum of conversation still filled the space, but something about the air had changed, something subtle yet undeniable. As the cashier handed over the receipt, the man hesitated before reaching out to take it, his fingers brushing against hers for only a moment. His hands were cold, rough from exposure, and something about that realization made her swallow down the automatic response she usually gave customers, the robotic, enjoy your meal, that she had repeated hundreds of times before. Instead, she just nodded once before stepping back, giving him space, as if recognizing that this moment wasn't just about food but about something larger, something unspoken. The manager gestured toward one of the open tables near the window, but the man didn't move immediately. He turned slightly, his gaze shifting back toward the street, as if half expecting someone to call him back, to tell him that this was all temporary, that he needed to leave now that the transaction was complete. When no one did, when no one rushed him out or told him that his presence was a disruption, his shoulders relaxed by the smallest fraction. He moved toward the table, pulling out the chair slowly, as if testing whether it would be taken away from him at the last second. When he finally sat, his posture remained stiff, but his eyes flickered with something distant, something that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the way people had treated him before this moment. The coffee arrived first, placed in front of him without a word. He didn't reach for it right away. Instead, he just stared at it, the steam rising in slow, curling tendrils, his fingers resting on the table as if grounding himself in the reality that this was actually happening. The The sandwich followed a few minutes later, a simple but well-made meal, something that most people wouldn't think twice about. But for him, it was more than that. He picked up the coffee first, his hands wrapping around the warmth, his fingers steady now, no longer twitching from hesitation. He took a slow sip, exhaling through his nose as the heat spread through his body, the sensation foreign but welcome. He set the cup down carefully, as if afraid of breaking the moment, before finally reaching for the sandwich, his movements slow, deliberate. Across the café, a few customers whispered to each other, some still casting glances in his direction, others deliberately looking away, as if pretending this wasn't happening made it easier for them to return to their comfortable routines. But not everyone ignored it. A man near the counter, a businessman in a tailored suit, watched quietly, his fingers tapping absently against his phone screen, unread messages piling up as he found himself unable to look away. A woman near the window adjusted her scarf, her gaze thoughtful, as if trying to reconcile the discomfort she felt with the undeniable reality of the moment. Outside, Taylor Swift was gone, her presence nothing more than an imprint on the air, a ripple in the usual flow of the city. She hadn't stayed to watch what would happen, hadn't waited for gratitude or validation. She had done what she had done and moved on, leaving behind only the weight of an action that spoke louder than anything else. The man sitting at the table exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the edges of the sandwich as he finally took his first bite. He chewed carefully, methodically, his gaze unfocused as if lost in thoughts he wouldn't share with anyone in the room. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just another forgotten figure on the street. He was seen. And that, more than anything, was what made this moment different from all the others before it. The sandwich was halfway gone when the man felt the shift around him, the kind of tension that wasn't spoken aloud but existed in the air, in the way people adjusted their posture, in the way their conversations softened or abruptly changed course. He had felt this sensation before, had lived with it for years, the weight of existing in spaces where people believed he did not belong. But this time, it was different, not because of pity, not because of the usual discomfort that followed when someone like him sat among them, but because for the first time, no one could deny that he had a reason to be here. The food in front of him was paid for, his presence sanctioned by someone with a name powerful enough to silence any argument against it. It wasn't charity that had placed him in this seat. It was permission. And somehow, that made all the difference. The businessman at the counter finally set his phone down, his coffee untouched as he continued watching the scene unfold, as if trying to decipher the exact moment when the lines between everyday normalcy and something unexpected had been crossed. He had seen moments of public generosity before, had even been a participant in them a few times when it was convenient, when slipping a few bills to someone on the street felt like enough to ease whatever guilt had been lingering in the back of his mind. But this wasn't the same. There was no performance here, no rehearsed act of kindness designed to be consumed and then forgotten. This was something quieter, something that had shifted the balance of the space without demanding recognition for it. A waitress walked past the man's table, her tray pressed close to her body, her eyes flicking toward him for only a second before darting away again. There was no rudeness in her expression, no open discomfort, but the unfamiliarity of the moment made her hesitate, made her question whether she should acknowledge what was happening or pretend that nothing about this was unusual. But the truth was, it was unusual. It was unusual because people like him weren't supposed to sit at tables like this, weren't supposed to eat meals that were given without conditions, weren't supposed to exist in spaces where their presence disrupted the comfortable rhythm of those who never had to wonder where their next meal would come from. The man set his sandwich down for a moment, his fingers pressing against the napkin beside his plate, his mind turning over the last 20 minutes like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't expected anything beyond the usual dismissive glance, the brief shake of a head, the quiet, unspoken command to move along. He had spent years being invisible, had grown used to the way people's eyes slid past him as if he were nothing more than background noise, a detail they preferred not to acknowledge. But Taylor Swift had acknowledged him. She had stopped, she had listened. She had made a decision that had turned this ordinary moment into something no one in this cafe would forget anytime soon. The woman near the window, the one with the expensive scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, finally leaned forward slightly, her fingers pressing against the edge of her cup as she spoke, her voice low enough that only the businessman near the counter could hear her. "Did you see that?" she asked, her tone carrying something between hesitation and curiosity, as if she was still processing what had unfolded in front of her. The businessman nodded, but he didn't immediately respond, his gaze still fixed on the man at the table, watching the way his shoulders remained tense, the way his movements were careful, precise, as if he still wasn't sure if this moment would be taken away from him at any second. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "I saw." The woman exhaled, shaking her head slightly, not in disapproval, but in something closer to disbelief. "I don't think I've ever seen someone do that without expecting something in return," she murmured, her fingers tightening around her cup. "No cameras, no announcements, no audience," the businessman finished for her, his jaw tightening slightly as if the thought unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite put into words. "Just a decision." A moment passed between them before the woman nodded, her expression unreadable as she turned her gaze back toward the man at the table, watching as he took another slow sip of his coffee, the steam curling into the air, vanishing before it could settle into something tangible. The cafe manager lingered near the register, his hands resting on the counter, his fingers tapping against the surface in a rhythmic, uncertain pattern. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he had first stepped outside to confront the man. Wasn't sure if he had believed Taylor Swift would simply brush past him like everyone else did. But she hadn't, and now, he found himself in a position he wasn't used to, one where he had to reconcile the rules he had enforced for so long with the reality of what had just happened. The security guard, the one who had been prepared to step in and remove the man before things had taken an unexpected turn, stood near the entrance, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. He had seen celebrities before, had watched as they navigated their carefully curated public personas, had seen the rehearsed interactions that always seemed designed for the cameras. But this wasn't that. This was something else, something that didn't fit neatly into the narrative people were used to seeing. Outside, the city moved forward as it always did, the sound of traffic filling the space that Taylor Swift had left behind. She was gone now, swallowed back into the endless rhythm of New York, her presence nothing more than a lingering ripple in the usual order of things. But the moment she had created remained, stretching beyond her departure, settling into the space in a way that no one could ignore. The man at the table finished his sandwich, his fingers brushing against the crumbs that had gathered on his napkin before he finally exhaled, his shoulders relaxing just slightly, just enough to suggest that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't bracing himself for the next moment of rejection, the next reminder that the world had long since decided he was easier to ignore than to acknowledge. He took another sip of his coffee, slower this time, more deliberate, as if savoring not just the taste but the feeling of existing in this space, of being seen, of being given something without conditions, without expectations, without the quiet, suffocating weight of judgment pressing against his back. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the world hadn't entirely forgotten about him after all. The man sat at the table longer than he expected, longer than he thought he would be allowed. The cafe didn't ask him to leave. No one approached with a forced smile and an unspoken demand to free up the space for paying customers. The coffee was nearly gone, the sandwich finished, but he remained still, fingers resting against the edge of the table, listening to the quiet hum of conversation that had returned to its usual rhythm. The air inside had shifted, but it had not fully settled, as if the people around him were still trying to process what had happened, unsure whether to forget it or let it change something in them. He didn't know what they saw when they looked at him now, whether he was still just another homeless man who had been given a meal by someone famous or if, for even a moment, he had become something more than just that. The businessman near the counter finally stood, smoothing his jacket before walking toward the exit, his steps slow, measured. As he passed the table, he glanced toward the man, and for the first time in the last hour, their eyes met. There was no hesitation, no discomfort, just a brief, quiet acknowledgement, a moment where neither of them said anything, but both understood that something about this was different from what either of them had expected when they had first walked into this cafe. The businessman nodded once, the movement small but deliberate, before pushing the door open and stepping back into the city, vanishing into the movement of the street. A few minutes later, the woman with the scarf followed, adjusting the strap of her purse as she hesitated near the door, as if debating whether to say something before leaving. But she didn't. Instead, she exhaled softly, shook her head to herself, and disappeared into the crowd, her expression unreadable. The cafe continued on as it always did. Workers moving behind the counter, customers coming and going, the usual flow of life returning even as the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. The man's fingers drummed lightly against the tabletop before he finally leaned back, stretching his shoulders as he prepared himself for the inevitable moment when he would have to step back outside, back into the world where moments like this didn't happen, back into the reality where no one looked at him twice. He was used to it, had learned how to navigate the silence, the way people pretended not to see him, the way their hands tensed around their pockets whenever he was near. This had been a break from that, an interruption in the usual pattern, but he knew better than to believe that it would last. He stood slowly, his movements careful, as if expecting someone to remind him that he wasn't supposed to be here, that the moment had expired. But no one did. The security guard glanced at him once but didn't move. The cashier busied herself with another customer, and the manager, who had been the first to try to push him away, was nowhere to be seen. He hesitated before turning toward the door, his fingers brushing against the edge of the table one last time before he stepped away, weaving through the cafe with the same quiet presence he had learned to adopt long ago. The air outside was colder than he remembered, the sky shifting into the early signs of evening, streetlights flickering to life one by one. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, the fabric worn and thin but familiar. He took a step forward, then another, slipping back into the movement of the street, his presence blending into the city just as it always had. Then he stopped. A few feet ahead, standing near the curb, Taylor Swift leaned against the open door of a sleek black car, her sunglasses still in place, her coat wrapped tightly around her frame as she spoke quietly to the driver. She hadn't left after all. She had simply stepped away, waiting for the moment to settle, for the scene inside to unfold without her presence dictating how it should end. She looked up as he approached, her head tilting slightly, as if studying him again, as if trying to see if the meal had done anything beyond filling his stomach. He stopped a few feet away, his hands slipping into the pockets of his coat, not out of nervousness, but out of the simple habit of someone who had spent years trying to take up as little space as possible. "You waited," he said, his voice even, lacking the disbelief that might have existed if this had been anyone else. Taylor shrugged slightly, her expression unreadable. "I wanted to see if you'd actually go inside," she admitted, the honesty in her words making the space between them feel smaller, more real. "Not everyone does." He exhaled slowly, nodding to himself, as if considering that. "I almost didn't," he admitted after a moment. "Thought maybe it was a joke, or a test." "It wasn't," she said simply. A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted, filled with something neither of them needed to name. "You gonna tell me your name now?" she asked, her tone light, but without expectation, without the forceful demand that people sometimes had when they thought they were entitled to answers. He considered that for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the street, watching as people passed without glancing their way, lost in their own lives, their own distractions. He had gone years without needing to say his name to anyone, had long since stopped expecting that anyone would care enough to ask. But she had, and somehow that mattered. "Daniel," he said finally, the name feeling foreign in his own mouth after so long. "It's Daniel." Taylor nodded once, her lips pressing together slightly, as if committing the name to memory. "Nice to meet you, Daniel." He didn't know what to say to that, didn't know how to respond to the simplicity of being acknowledged in a way that wasn't followed by pity or obligation. So he just nodded, shifting his weight slightly, feeling the quiet pull of the city urging him forward, back into the rhythm of the night. Taylor glanced toward her driver, giving a small nod before turning back to Daniel, her expression steady. "Take care of yourself." It wasn't a command, not a parting phrase meant to fill silence, but something more, something that didn't require a response but lingered anyway. Daniel watched as she stepped into the car, the door closing with a soft finality before the vehicle pulled away, merging into the endless current of the city. He stood there for a moment longer, letting the last few hours settle into something he could carry with him, something that would exist beyond this one moment. Then he turned and walked into the city, his steps steady, his name still lingering in the air, as if, for the first time in a long time, it had found a place where it mattered again.